some of them have kind of drunk their own Kool-Aid.
These lies eventually can become truth.
If we just receive passively what the algorithm is giving us, there's not really much hope.
Welcome back to the Plan Podcast. Myself, Simon Bogle, and Ben Backwell. We touched upon some things before, and I'm going to just jump straight into the weeds with this because we talked about the term Dark Enlightenment. Where did it come from? What's it about? Does it even matter?
Yeah. Morning, Simon. Great to be here again. So Dark Enlightenment, what does that even mean? So first of all, it's an idea that I guess has been germinating for maybe about 20, 30 years, maybe around that time. It's suddenly become very newsworthy because it's been adopted by some key figures in the US right, I think we could describe them, but also figures which are very influential in the Trump administration. And so these ideas, which have been circulating for some time, suddenly people are starting to wake up and look at who's into these ideas. And some of the people who are into this idea of Dark Enlightenment or have been connected with it, wrongly or rightly, people like J D Vance, the US vice president, also some of the tech barons like Elon Musk, Mark Andreessen, the tech VC capitalist. So these kind of people. And linked to this idea of Dark Enlightenment is this idea of a kind of neo-reactionary movement, or NRX, it's called. So the idea of the Dark Enlightenment is really a kind of family of ideas. Not everyone. It's not like there's not like a book that I mean, there's some text, but it's not like there's a book where you kind of got a manifesto and everything's in that book. I mean, there are different manifestos and different books and different ideas that are linked to Dark Enlightenment that we can kind of examine. So there's ideas like accelerationism, for instance, which is, I would argue, is quite important for Dark Enlightenment. But let's maybe start at the beginning. I mean, why is it Dark Enlightenment? So, the Enlightenment is this period where there's a kind of intellectual revolution around the world. You have the kind of famous Enlightenment figures who were able to kind of start using science as their lens for looking at the world and push back on the kind of old, kind of more religious dominated, more kind of traditionalist dominated society, and use ideas to demystify or to kind of enlighten the world, right? To bring light into the world. But this is Dark Enlightenment. So why is it dark? And this is something I thought about a little bit. I'm not entirely sure why it's the Dark Enlightenment. I think it's about the Enlightenment was generally hopeful, and it was essentially seen as something that was linked to democracy, whereas the Dark Enlightenment is linked to something probably a bit harder edged, a bit darker, a bit kind of less hopeful, a bit more realist, a bit more cynical. So I think that's part of it, is this idea of Dark Enlightenment. And you've got this kind of idea of kind of, the old Enlightenment was naive. This Enlightenment is based upon the hard realities of technology and power. So I think that's where it comes from. It's interesting, you had Elon Musk around the time of the inauguration, or just before the inauguration, in the last stages of the Trump election campaign, showing up with his dark MAGA hat, which was basically Make America Great baseball cap, but in black. And he dresses like a bit of a kind of maybe a goth, or somebody who's into kind of wearing dark clothing. So he had this idea of dark MAGA. So it's not the kind of red Republican MAGA, but it's a kind of dark MAGA. And he was actually shouting out. He was actually shouting out, "This is dark MAGA. This is dark MAGA." And at the time, a lot of people were like, "What's he talking about?" And then actually Trump himself said at one point, he said, "There's this thing called dark MAGA. It's really popular," he said. Again, he didn't really say why or what it's all about, but it was really popular. Now, that's not Dark Enlightenment, but I think it's probably linked to it in the kind of imagination of these people somehow. So what is it? Where does it come from? So it's basically the idea that technology and democracy are not compatible. I mean, if I really wanted to encapsulate it in one phrase, it's that technology is moving in a certain way, that technological development of these new technologies like AI is inevitable, that our human future is changing very rapidly, probably towards some kind of type of transhumanism, of kind of transcending the limits of the human biology and maybe merging with machines, and that these ideas and this technological progress, as they see it, is somehow incompatible with democracy, or shouldn't have any brakes put upon it by democracy. So I think that's kind of the key idea, I think.
So it's kind of the underpinning of a technological dictatorship is kind of what we're looking at. Would you, or is that too harsh a terminology? If democracy is something that's being thrown out of the window, and also we see people like Elon lobbying themselves into government and being professed as the actual president rather than Trump himself, with the kind of power that he had, and how he was dictating influence in there. And obviously money plays a big part in pushing this as a catalyst as well as the technology. So if democracy is moved to the side and it becomes a monarchy of sorts, or a tenocracy, they seem to be very bold in the way they're pushing this stuff forward, very brazen in the way they're telling people. Is that playing to people's naivety?
Yeah, I mean, let's go back first of all. This idea, is it a dictatorship? So there's different strands of the thinking. So the strand probably closest to that idea is this idea of a techno king. So yeah, you need a techno monarch.
Okay.
And many of these people have put forward the ideas that countries should be run more like corporations. So you have a CEO who's a very talented, driven individual who has kind of special knowledge or skills, and really that individual should be allowed to rule based on their unique kind of talents or the amount of resources they've managed to accumulate, right? And you shouldn't hold them back, right? So the idea of the techno monarch, techno king, and that's then reflected in a lot of kind of memes and kind of ideas as well around having a kind of a god emperor, or those kind of ideas which come again from kind of games and science fiction. So that's probably the most the strand of it which is closest to the idea of a dictatorship. But then there's a lot of this comes from a very libertarian strand of thinking on the right as well. So you've got this kind of idea of techno libertarians. And these people are essentially saying we just don't want any restrictions. So there's a whole idea of the sovereign individual. Again, very famous book. It's one of Peter Thiel's book. We'll come on to this. Peter Thiel is one of the kind of key figures in this whole network, in this universe. And the idea, again, is that governments and states should not be putting restrictions on what the sovereign individual, who's this very uniquely talented individual who has lots of money, should be able to do. Right? And then some of the key thinkers have also looked at breaking up the state, breaking it up or making it irrelevant. So they're into forming new countries.
Right. So Ben, just want to take it back a little bit. You mentioned also in the sort of pilot episode as well about a man called Curtis Yarvin. Can you tell us a little bit more about who he is and why he's so important in this discussion?
Yeah. So there's two intellectual figures, I'd say, who are the authors of this movement to the extent that anyone is, in terms of the genesis of the ideas. One is Curtis Yarvin, who mainly has written under the name of Mencius Moldbug. And then the other one is Nick Land. And they're two very, very different individuals, and they've had very different outcomes in their lives as well. So, and it's really interesting because they're two individuals on different sides of the world, completely different backgrounds, but somehow their ideas end up influencing each other, and their ideas kind of become connected into this idea of Dark Enlightenment, which I believe was coined by Nick Land. But it's been taken up and popularized maybe in a different way to the way Nick Land expected by Curtis Yarvin. But maybe let's start with Curtis Yarvin. So Curtis Yarvin now is an important established figure in the US right, and this whole neo-reactionary movement, even if he may not use that term. And he's seen almost as a kind of semi-official philosopher of the right-wing movement around the Trump administration. Right. So he was at the inauguration and events around that and dinners. And he's done a podcast in the New York Times recently. So he's out there, and people know who he is. Peter Thiel, who's a key figure in the whole US tech kind of venture capital corporate network, has called him my most important connection. So his influence is clear, and he's really a fringe US thinker who's been pushing some extremely anti-democratic ideas for quite a long time. Some of them are around this idea of neo-cameralism, or this kind of new medievalist idea of just many cities and territories being run as corporations without democracy. But he's also made some very provocative statements around things like slavery, around equality. He said that anybody who doesn't have a stake in the property system should basically be made to wear a tag.
And this is Thiel or Yarvin?
This is Yarvin. So for instance, he said at one point, anybody who's not a property owner or someone who's got wealth, essentially should wear a tag, and then if there's no crime in your area, then there's no problem. Hugely worrying kind of anti-democratic kind of idea. So he has become popular, and although he hasn't taken an open role in politics, and he still seems to be fairly shy of the limelight in some ways. I think he sees himself very much as a philosopher behind the scenes. And then Nick Land was a British academic who back then in the 90s was involved in this thing called the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit at the University of Warwick, which from the start was a rather rogue outfit, which got very into this kind of idea of the cyborg, the whole kind of idea around some of those sci-fi novels around the time, like the Neuromancer, this idea of kind of hacking into people's brains and kind of forming a kind of hybrid human robotic.
The title sounds rather ominous in itself, just the name of the company. So.
Yeah, it also sounds a bit dated, right? It was this kind of stuff when robots were still really cool and
the Jetsons.
Yeah, it's kind of a bit like I don't know, the Terminator was out there, and it was basically a bunch of academics who kind of wanted to embrace this kind of future in some way, and instead of trying to slow it down, kind of say let's explore where it can go, and in fact they take a lot of ideas from the kind of French postmodernist, post-structuralist thinkers who are into essentially accelerating trends within society in order to exacerbate the contradictions in some way. So some kind of revolutionary aim behind kind of letting society accelerate or making society accelerate. But then he takes that and kind of essentially becomes very enamored of this idea of technology and this cyborg and this kind of cybernetic revolution that's going to happen. They also took copious amounts of drugs and were into a lot of electronic music, and would do these kind of happenings where they were kind of rolling around on the floor. And from what I've read, Nick Land has a breakdown through excessive amphetamine use, and then kind of reinvents himself. He goes off and lives in China. He then becomes a kind of advocate for the techno state, and he gets very enamored with Asian places like Singapore and Hong Kong, and then China. At that phase, kind of before the Beijing Olympics, when it looked like China was kind of at the apex of modernity. So he kind of gets into this whole idea of kind of the techno state that's going to be more efficient than capitalism, or not capitalism, but more efficient than the kind of democratic state that we're used to. And then he morphs from that into a kind of very kind of pro-technology, pro-capitalist position, where he just says, it's only capitalism technology that's going to continually revolutionize things, and we just need to let it rip, essentially, and see where this whole thing is going to go, and anybody who's holding that back in a way is the problem.
I'd like to sort of soon drill down into the idea of this kind of techno state, but with these individuals, from your position, from what you've read on them, does it feel more like they are trying to concrete their own legacy and masquerade it as progression for humankind? Or do you think genuinely these people believe that it is a true progression of where we need to go as a species in order for things to survive and be better for everybody within society.
Yeah, I think again, they're really different individuals. I think Curtis Yarvin does have a political project. It's not one that I personally agree with or like, but it's a political project that he's put a large amount of years in his life behind creating. Right. I think Nick Land is essentially a renegade academic who's gone down a very, very dark rabbit hole, both intellectually and personally. And it's almost like an accident that his ideas have been taken up by these US right-wing thinkers. I think they've taken some of his ideas that suited them. Again, very brutal, kind of very nihilistic ideas, and they've just taken those, and they've taken the term Dark Enlightenment. And some of the ideas around accelerationism that we'll go
Just
into.
reframed it as their own, really.
They've just reframed it in a way that kind of works for that whole ecosystem in the US. But I definitely, they're also, I'd definitely say probably Nick Land, we're not going to see much more of him. Curtis Yarvin, we are seeing more of him now.
But that kind of returning of a narrative we've seen before, not going too deep into things, but in Nazism with like the swastika, where they took the Hindu symbolism and sort of completely changed that narrative and turned it into their own. And you touched upon before this idea of like news outlets who are sort of purporting all of this stuff out now. When we talk about news outlets, it's like things used to be a lot slower because it's traditional legacy media. Now we've fundamentally got, and to a degree, those narratives are always being controlled through their own forms of censorship, whether we call those editors or people who are lobbying some of those papers or TV channels. But now, obviously, with the advent of social media over the last sort of 15 odd years, which is being controlled by these technocrats, they're very much more clearly and succinctly being able to put their message out. So it'd be quite interesting to find out how Curtis Yarvin actually ties into that political aspect with people like the Elon Musks or the Bezoses, if they're sitting at the same round table, so to speak, almost in a sort of cartel manner, or whether it's, whether they just want to become the new celebrity of the day.
Yeah, but I think quite often, the way that intellectuals function and the way that intellectual life functions, you influence and you have a kind of a deeper, bigger context to what you're saying, right? It doesn't mean necessarily that then the public figures, the business figures, the political people, the people who are on, the people of action who are going to do things, it doesn't mean they're going to take up all your ideas. They'll pick and choose what they want. You can certainly see that with Dark Enlightenment. It may, it's definitely not something that they're going to be kind of making a kind of badge out of and saying we are the Dark Enlightenment movement. It's more about a set of ideas for me that are pushing the window or pushing the envelope of what's possible, right? So you kind of take these very extreme ideas, and they are really extreme ideas, and not all of those ideas necessarily going to happen anytime soon. But what they do is they allow you to push the envelope of discussion and what's acceptable to discuss, right? And you can see that with what's happening in the US. So yeah, they haven't gone full dictatorship. Doge is not completely unlimited in its actions and so on. But they have managed to put somebody who's unelected into government for a while. They've run people's jobs and job titles through AIs, and they've fired tens of thousands of people in a way that's not accountable or democratic. So some of it's possible, right? And often you need the really extreme ideas to enable what you're able to do. So that's kind of how I see it. And it's interesting with Nick Land because his idea of Dark Enlightenment in a way is like there's this future coming. We kind of need to embrace it. It's not necessarily going to be nice or something that we can even recognize as humans, but we're going to have to kind of embrace it. There's also a certain thrill to embracing it, and I think this is where the whole science fiction element that we've talked about. So you get a thrill of watching the Terminator. Right? I mean, it's out there to kill you, but it's kind of thrilling on some level as well. This kind of artificial intelligence, these robots, this kind of future of kind of spaceships. And I think that's a really important part in this, right? And that's why Dark Enlightenment's an important concept, because it's kind of like, it is dark, but it's also slightly thrilling as well. And Nick Land had a whole theory around this, which again, I don't want to go too deeply into, but he took it. A lot of the ideas come from the French philosophers, and it's this kind of idea of kind of enjoyment, of kind of embracing kind of this acceleration and gaining pleasure from it in some way.
Yeah, it's quite interesting how some of these, how we can connect the dots with some of these things, especially with like Elon and sort of Doge and things like that, and how, you know, in terms of manipulating minds, how he was tweeting about meme coins like the Doge coin, things like that. So automatically he's appealing to an audience there, a decentralized audience or a more technical savvy audience to sort of kind of bring people in around to these kind of views. So I think when you look at all those different kind of nuances that kind of play, it does feel sometimes like there is a plan, or is there something more, that there is something more heavily orchestrated underneath, or at least an idea or something. I suppose the worrying thing now is just whether the people who are pushing these ideas forwards are still in control of these ideas, or whether these ideas already have taken on a new life in terms of, you know, how we see AI encroaching upon us. You know, is this really something to be fearful? Is this really something we need to worry about? Or is it going to be another year 2000 bug type thing? You know, how much of this is kind of fear and propaganda in order to gain real estate in the world, both in terms of publicity but also power? Because as a billionaire, you know, there's only so many watches and cars that you can buy. You want to play other games, you want to do other things. You know?
Yeah, I guess what's interesting about this moment is that the ideology has been adopted by people who have tremendous power and unprecedented resources. I don't think we've ever really seen that before. You know, you got these kind of these capitalists who've just amassed just incredible power, just sums of money and assets that we've never seen before, and they've adopted these ideas to a certain extent. And there's different levels to this. There's a more dark side. So you've got people who are definitely more negative and kind of have a darker vision of the future. I'd say Peter Thiel has a pretty dark vision of the future. Some of these people we've discussed, but then you've got people like Mark Andreessen, probably the most influential venture capitalist of the history of this whole Silicon Valley phenomenon over the last 30, 40 years. And again, his manifesto, he has this techno-futurist manifesto. I mean, it's just saying, look, this stuff is going to be amazing. It's all just going to be amazing, and just trust us, because if you try and slow it down, then you're bad. You're morally bad if you try and slow this down. This is going to bring such incredible benefits to humanity that anybody tries to slow us down, is somehow doing something wrong. Right? And obviously these people are playing their book. I mean, they're all making huge amounts of money and amassing huge amounts of power, but they're also incredibly influential, and they're influential over people and the public because of their control over communications technologies, and increasingly they're influential directly into politics, and they're putting money into politics, which is different.
But it's quite interesting. I mean, we talked here on the way over in the car, and I won't mention the name of the podcast, it was kind of discussed because it's all kind of alleged and hearsay. But there was a point where this particular host was talking about some people who are at the forefront, or a person who's at the forefront of AI, who's given TED Talks, rather optimistic TED Talks, speaking publicly about how wonderful AI is going to be, just as you were mentioning before. But behind closed doors at billionaires' tables, they're sitting down and giving a completely different narrative. So it seems like, money and politics is the underlying factor here, or is it kind of that they've sold a narrative and now they feel the need to double down to stay, honest and true to their kind of history. It just seems that everything is kind of a lot more interconnected than we kind of say. I mean, we've had a big rise of, the alt-right over the last 10 years. Now, what was considered fringe now is coming to the forefront. And there's a kind of mockery, or like the jester in the, in the king's house, basically, is now taken to the stage, where those are the Borises or the Elons or the Trumps of the world, and maybe that is a kind of a narrative of smoke and mirrors to make us look one way, while, before people cotton onto the fact that actually maybe it's not a utopia that we're heading towards, maybe it's something more sinister, which it may not be. And it's trying to find out the mindsets of these people, because we live in these different echo chambers from how we search on social media, which I think is a lot of the way that people consume the news now. But I think there's also this kind of, not necessarily lack of understanding, but people forget who is actually in charge of these large companies, these algorithms, and these tend to be the people who are kind of as you're saying, pushing this idea of potential dark enlightenment or something which is on a parallel line to that, and it becomes something which becomes very hard to disassociate from if you're constantly being force-fed information that you don't want. The truth eventually, or the lies eventually can become the truth or people's personal truths, so how do we combat that, or coming back to sort of like Curtis Yarvin, who seems to be one of these kind of major players in it, is there somebody who's the major opposer in all of this? Are there other people that we should be listening to who've got a completely different swing or different take on what they're trying to do?
I think what's interesting is that a lot of the tech barons have just realized there's nobody's going to stop us. And if you look at the situation, even 5 years ago, there was this kind of sense that social media, had some catching up to do. It was putting out fake news and disinformation. It was having a harmful effect on people's mental health. And, some of these tech brands were actually quite apologetic. And, you watch some of those appearances by Mark Zuckerberg, in Congress a few years ago, and it looked like, it's pretty defensive, pretty apologetic, right? Now it's kind of, I think what's happened is that the really powerful figures have realized nobody is going to stop them. And I think that's coincided also with things like the kind of no progress or the kind of stalling of antitrust legislation and procedures, where there was talk about breaking up monopolies. None of that's really gone anywhere. And what that's given, I think, some of these billionaires is a sense of just untrammeled power. And they've definitely become more unhinged. I mean, the ideas have become less
100%,
reasonable.
yeah.
It's kind of crazier, right? And now some of that's dark, and some of it's just this kind of acceleration. And we'll go on to this idea of accelerationism, but some of it's just this idea of kind of embracing scary tech, right? So Elon Musk calling his son X, whatever he's called him, right? Just kind of embracing this kind of tech, kind of brutalism, I'd call it. And then some of it's kind of smiley and happy, right? So you look at Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI. It's actually the same vision. It's kind of, don't try and stop this. It's going to happen. But his vision is all very smiley. It's all kind of emoji hugs, and it's just, this is going to be amazing, guys. In 1,000, 2,000 or 3,000 days, we're just going to be in this completely new world. It's going to solve all the problems, and it's going to cure cancer. And it's going to do everything. It's kind of the same vision, but it's different types of PR, and different ways that the individuals present the vision as well. So I mean, Mark Andreessen in his manifesto, he still kind of presents it as a positive thing, although he also quotes in his manifesto none other than Marinetti, who's the futurist artist, then became the kind of ideologue for Mussolini, who's an out and out glorifier of war and misogyny and and kind of anti-human sentiments, right? So it's not far beneath the surface, this kind of anti-humanism, right? And whether that's expressed in a kind of positive way of kind of the AI is going to just solve all our problems, or whether it's expressed in a negative way of kind of we're hurtling to this kind of dark future, but it's going to be exciting at least.
Well, I think fundamentally for me, there's two tiers or two different dangerous ingredients. One is the amount of money that these tech guys have, basically. And the other side is understanding. And we've seen when these things have gone into Congress and things like that before, that the people behind the benches who are talking to people like the likes of Zuckerberg have very little to any understanding of the technology they're dealing with, which allows these people to sort of pummel through and do exactly kind of what they want with these things because of lack of understanding. It kind of reminds me of the old days we used to have the war between the science and the arts, and if you went and saw a piece of art, if you didn't understand it, then obviously you weren't of the same intellectual standing. So you get a lot of falsehoods coming from Congress or things like that, pertaining that they understand these things when they really don't. They're almost like 5, 6, 7 years behind the curve, and I think that equates almost to them, people looking at these guys as having a good or an ultimate vision because they're the only ones leading this forward, where I don't think they've necessarily thought all this stuff through themselves, And maybe there are people on the outskirts of it or the inside of it, like Yarvin and stuff, who actually see a bigger or greater game plan for themselves to, go in and take charge once the the Elons and the Zuckerbergs of the world take a slight step back, which I don't think necessarily will happen. And whatever their political views are is being pushed through these algorithms, being pushed through these kind of politics and being reinforced with the lights of the Dark Enlightenment.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that they are highly opportunistic, and they're capable at some points of embracing kind of very progressive-looking causes, or kind of So, for instance, Bezos has put money into environmental causes. His wife runs a philanthropy around kind of environmental causes, and that's part of their kind of makeup, is that we're solving the problems of humanity, right? And then they show up at Cannes, for instance. Last week was the Cannes Film Festival. Show up in this enormous super yacht with another kind of tender yacht behind it, which needs to go with it at all times to kind of look after all the needs of the people on the super yacht. And it's kind of like a laughing stock in a way of people saying, how are these people going to be environmentalists? But they don't really care. It's just kind of part of a kind of shifting narrative. I mean, my sense is just that they're highly opportunistic. Then they could easily drop Dark Enlightenment if it became a problem for them. They can drop most of the ideas, right? What they're looking for are ideas somehow that push the envelope and justify some of the things that they would like to do. And to some extent, some of them have kind of drunk their own Kool-Aid, and they literally believe that's what they're going to do.
That's what I was about to say. I think that's where one of the major differences is that rather than opportunity arising, they're in a position to create those opportunities themselves, to create those narratives, to make people think a certain way, to make it look like they're doing acts of good, rather than sort of saying, okay, there's an opportunity over there, let's side with this. They can create a whole narrative around that, and we've seen that with the likes of things like Cambridge Analytica, all those kind of things. And I suppose that's where it's kind of worrying. They seem to have control from several sides as opposed from just one.
Yeah, but some of these people were very far-thinking, and we haven't mentioned Steve Bannon yet, who's obviously the kind of thinker behind the first Trump, and is still very influential in the US right.
Very involved in the UK politics as well.
Very involved in UK politics. He's involved, with his movement now in many, many other countries. He's also somebody who's fallen out massively with Elon Musk. Kind of just insults a lot of the tech barons. He sees himself as standing up for the common person, rather than for California tech and so on. But he's also somebody who's very involved in the tech world. One of the founders of Cambridge Analytica that you just mentioned. Very, very far-thinking thinkers about how information and technology is able to change the way that we can influence politics. Runs his War Room podcast. Was somebody who realised that he could change the media world when he bought Breitbart News and made that into a big popular kind of forum for new right-wing ideas and so on. So some of these people are very, very far-thinking. I think they're able to be far-thinking because a lot of their thinking is very kind of it's very kind of obsessive in many cases. But they kind of know where they're going, and they're able to articulate big ideas in the way that I think the left doesn't anymore. And I think that's really important. And maybe just one thought. I mean, how much of this is real? So I mean, I was just thinking of something the other day. I mean, Elon Musk now has applied to incorporate his city, right? So he's there's this City of Starbase incorporation election that was held. It looks like it's happening. It's a new town in Texas where 60% of the people work for Elon Musk. They're going to have a few commissioners running the city. Obviously, if you work for Elon Musk, it's questionable how much you're going to go against the corporate interest. And he's essentially formed a corporate town in the middle of nowhere in Texas where they can do what he wants to do, which is build rockets and data centers and do the stuff he wants to do. So there is an element of reality, and they have amassed huge amounts of resource. And that's ultimately, I think, behind a lot of what they're trying to do. So the reason, and just going back to Dark Enlightenment and all these anti-government ideas, the reason why it's useful for them is because governments are holding them back. And that's why, social media platforms they control have gone in there and really subverted democracies in many, many places and created a lot of conflict, disharmony, political fragmentation, right? I mean, they see the state as holding them back, and that's a key idea. Dark Enlightenment, it's a key idea of those kind of older ideas around Ayn Rand. The government is holding them back. And if they can disrupt it, that doesn't mean they don't want government, but if they can disrupt it and make it less able to hold them back, I think that's something that they definitely do want.
Or to become the government in itself.
Or to become the government in itself in different places. And one of the people we haven't mentioned is Balaji Srinivasan, who's another of the VC capitalists, made a lot of money. And he's probably kind of most identified also with Yarvin as well. And he's got this idea of the network state, which again is a very popular idea. I think it's part of this family of ideas around Dark Enlightenment. The network state is basically a plan for technology executives, CEOs, large holders of capital to be able to just remove themselves from states and just form their own, to create their own sovereign states, which would be run along a kind of corporation level or something like that. And it's serious. I mean, he pumps out his ideas. They've tried different ways of doing it. They tried the whole idea of seasteading. Do you remember that one?
Yeah.
And that was the idea of kind of creating these little...
It's kind of like Waterworld.
Waterworld, exactly. That's Waterworld. You go and create these little kind of islands and you create these kind of new sovereign areas. They've also tried free states in territories like Honduras and places like that, where they try and essentially kind of carve out their own state or create a kind of charter state, which is governed by a different constitution from the rest of the state. They're pushing the boundaries to see how far they can extend their own power, their own sovereign power, right? As a sovereign individual or the sovereign capitalist or the sovereign tech baron, they want to be sovereign to some extent, right? They don't want people holding them back. I mean, who does, right? None of us, necessarily want people holding us back.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose one of the things I want to make sure that we get covered in this episode as it kind of rounds up is sort of like, just in terms of all these names and things that we're talking about now, in case we don't have time to sort of fully cover it or dismantle it in this episode, which we'll do over time in some of the other episodes as well. I think what's really been helpful and what's really been key is those key names, the names who are the ones to kind of watch out for. And for me personally, it's to try and not educate people, but give them a tool to see past the jesters in the courtroom and actually see that, when somebody's making a big thing on social media over here, that something maybe else may be going on with this hand here. And we've seen that through history about how these kind of things kind of play out, not just in the US, but, globally as well. Are there any other names or anything like that you'd throw into the mix concerning this?
No, I think it's really important, as you say, for people to start to get to grips with these ideas and not just ignore them. I mean, I really get the sense for many reasonable people that they'd rather it just went away and that these ideas these ideas is just crazy. So let's not engage with it because it's just crazy, or Elon Musk is crazy, or this or that individual is crazy. That doesn't help us. We need these people. And these ideas are incredibly influential, and they've occupied a space that is no longer occupied by the ideas of the 1960s or 70s and so on. And so getting to grips with these ideas is really important. They're not hidden. They're out there in plain sight. Many of these people quite helpfully have written manifestos, and so they're out there online. There's 3 or 4 really, really good books around this stuff, and people are starting to write more about it. And there's some very good journalists who are exploring, deeply the kind of intellectual history, but also kind of what these ideas mean, but in a way that is really engaging with it rather than just trying to make it disappear or pretend it's not happening. And I think that's the key thing is don't pretend it's not happening. Try and understand it.
Well, I think it's that premise of maybe it's not necessarily the right word for it, but the idea of deschooling oneself to the understanding of that, because you've got your 2.4 children, everything's running kind of smoothly and stuff like that. Things are going to change quite quickly, quite massively if this is allowed to keep going en route. In order to deschool, you have to reschool in other areas as well, and see both sides of the coin, so you can use the tool, which is your mind, to come up with your own thought process and personal beliefs, rather than being force-fed or foie gras by the algorithm, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's a really good way to end this as a takeaway. I mean, people are going to need to exercise some independence of thought and independence of criterion in this world. You know, if we just receive passively what the algorithm is giving us, there's not really much hope, in my view. We can't fight yesterday's battles. The old world's not coming back, and the old world of trusted, gatekeepers for good or for bad that controlled media and how we get information is not coming back anytime soon. So maybe there's an opportunity here for individuals to go to a new level and to exercise their own judgment in a much more active way. But it requires some work and it requires some understanding, and it also requires some work to find good information as well. And I think one of the things I'd like to encourage in this podcast is for people to really learn, again, how to go out and find information and how to process information in a way that is maybe deeper, a bit slower, a bit more useful, a bit more giving of context and insights, right? And I think it's possible. People can still do that. Maybe just to say one more thing around the Dark Enlightenment. I mean, it is a dark idea. And it's one of those ideas that's a bit like a kind of a nod and a wink. It's kind of saying, guys, we know this is not great for everyone, but it's kind of cool, isn't it?
The villain always has, the best arc. We're definitely going to continue doing this, and we'll probably delve a little bit more into Dark Enlightenment over future episodes. But going forward, I think that on the next episode, what is it we want to discuss, what we want to look for?
So the next episode is called The Assault on Reality, which again, very, very big idea. But actually, it kind of encapsulates a lot of the thinking at the moment, is that reality itself is a problem. So what happens when you get very powerful people who essentially want to abolish reality? That's what the next episode's about.
Excellent.